All right, today we're going to talk about some of the theories in Chapter 3 on cognitive and intrapersonal communication. Um, there are just a couple of them I really want to spend some time talking about. I think the others are really, I see them as less communicative as some of the other theories in the other chapters in this book. So we'll only go over a couple of these in detail. But first of all, a couple of things before we get started. One, I'm not going to talk about Kelly's covariation model, except do focus on table 3.1. Those are aspects of attributions that are going to be a little bit different than what I'm going to talk about, but could easily ask a question on the test about that. And so I will signpost such a question by talking about something like framing that as according to Kelly's covariation model or the like. Don't worry about uncertainty reduction theory. It's a theory that was developed in the 70s, in part in response to the complaints that a lot of people had about communication not being very scientific. And of course, to have scientific theories, you needed axioms and theorems and connections like that. And it goes into way too much more detail than what we're interested in. So we'll only focus on uncertainty reduction theory if the group that's doing this chapter chooses that as their theory to talk about. Cognitive dissonance theory is something you've heard about before, and I'm not really going to go into that much because it's really more of a cognitive theory about how we make sense out of something, especially when we try to reconcile inconsistent beliefs. It's a very famous theory, but it's not one we're going to spend much time with, again, unless one of the groups that goes and talks about this chapter chooses that theory to talk about. All right, attribution theory, though, is interesting and has a lot of communicative significance. Attribution theory focuses on cognitive processes related to how we explain human behavior. For example, why did that person do that thing? Or why did that group do that thing? What is my explanation for that? And it has three dimensions of these attributions. One is locus, and that is it something that the source is internal, that is, it's coming from within the actor, him or herself, or is it something that's really attributed to the situation, thus external? So if I tell you, or if you tell me you missed class because you slept late, and you just didn't wake up in time, that would be an internal attribution related to you and the fact that you slept late. On the other hand, something that would be an external explanation is if you use as an excuse, my alarm didn't go off, or I had a flat when I was coming to town to take the test, then that would be associated with something that happened beyond the actors due to the situation, not to the individual. In the first example I gave, it's more like to the individual. Stability deals with, is this a behavior that is consistent over time? Is this something that this is pretty typical of this person or this group? Versus something that's unstable, this isn't something that happens on a regular basis. It just happens occasionally. So for example, if you are someone who's perpetually late, then that would be a stable attribution. So-and-so is always late, either because that's who they are, it's a cultural thing, or something of that sort. That would be a stable attribution, being that this is something that typifies this person much of the time. Unstable, on the other hand, would be something that would be like where normally you're on time all the time, except this one instance. So what's up with that? And there may be some explanation for it, but we would consider that an unstable attribution, meaning that this isn't characteristic of the way you typically behave. And then finally, controllability, is this something an actor can control, or is it something that's beyond their control? So you could have something that was controllable. And so, for example, in the sleeping late, if you're just a person who just sleeps late, that's actually a controllable thing. If you could take steps to set your alarm or set your phone so that it could go off to wake you up. It would be more uncontrollable if it was more related to a medical condition like narcolepsy or something like that, which was something you really couldn't control because that's just the way your body was. So With these attributions, there are a number of what are called attributional biases, where I wouldn't necessarily, I would say it sort of distorts our way of thinking, but it more slants our way of thinking as it helps us make sense out of the world around us. The fundamental attribution error is this is where we make situational explanations for why we did things, whereas we make predispositional explanation for others. So this would be an example of where the reason why I did something is because under the circumstances, this was the right thing to do. I'm normally am someone who shows up on time, but I didn't show up on time this time, and it was due to the circumstances. It was due to something that was I was responding to the situation. I could give an excuse, I could give a justification, I could do something, but it's something that I would attribute my action due to action taken given the situation. We tend to ascribe predispositional explanations to others. That is, they did that because they're that kind of person. So I might say, for example, that I'm kind of shy in this circumstance because I'm with some people I don't know that well, and they're talking about something that I'm not very familiar with. So I'm not being very talkative because of this situation of who we're with, and what we're talking about. Whereas on the other hand, if I'm in this group and I see someone else that's being shy and not talking much, I would make an attribution of, oh, well, they're probably just a shy person. So that's the fundamental attribution error. Exceptionality effect, we've already talked about that in the last, in some of the material for test one, and we'll cover it some again as well. And this is where we tend to over-attribute cause to exceptional circumstances. And that is when I look at you and I see that there is something that you did that was pretty remarkable and that showed a strength or an attribute, I sign because of what you did. I then look at that and think that that's the kind of person you really are, even if other aspects of your behavior historically have not been consistent with that level of performance. Recency effect is when we over-attribute cause to the most recent event. So you're late this one time. You've been on time before. You're late this one time. It must be that you're starting to slack off a little bit and now starting to be less committed to our group. Whereas the primacy effect, that's where we over-attribute the cause to the first impression. And this was related to that test question that I gave, in which I said in that first impression on the job, your employer didn't have a very good impression of you, and subsequently from that time on, they tended to treat you rather coldly. That would be an example of a primacy effect. Okay, appears we are jumping around here with our PowerPoint. All right, now self-fulfilling prophecy, I did not define that, but I am going to explain it because it would just take up too much word space to explain it using words. So the self-fulfilling prophecy works like this. If I make an initial impression of you, like suddenly in my class, in the first day of class, you come off as really engaged and smart and on top of things, I might have a real positive first impression of you. And then I react to you in a positive way. I say, smile at you. I ask on you. I engage you when talking to you in class. That then reinforces your experience in this class. You said something. I reacted positively. That then gave you some encouragement. You subsequently act positive, engage in later interactions, and you simply confirm what I thought about you to begin with. You are a smart, actively engaged student. And that process is in large part because of the way I reacted to you and treated to you and responded to you at first. And then your subsequent behaviors simply confirm my initial expectation because of your response to the way I was treating you. Conversely, let's suppose that I think I do not have a very good first impression of you. You didn't seem to be paying attention. You weren't in class. I asked you a question. You didn't look like you had read the material. I then may make an impression of you that, well, maybe you're not a very good student, not very much engaged. That may show in the way that I interact with you. I may interact with you with less interest in what you have to say, with more neutral kind of affect, not really pay attention much to what you say. When I respond to you that way, these are pretty negative kinds of messages that are being sent to you. You then may be a little more reluctant, a little more shy, a little more cautious about speaking up and being uncertain, and your own affect may be more kind of neutral or guarded. And then I would look at that and I would say, see, I told you so. You're not a very good student. And it's not based upon whether or not you're a good student or not. It's based upon how I reacted to you at first, based upon a first impression, the way you responded to the way I was treating you. And that response simply confirms what I already thought about you. Now, halo and pitchfork effect are simply where we look at things we tend to over attribute positive things to certain people because we like them a lot. We respect them a lot. So one thing that we do with doctors, because a lot of people like doctors, is when we ask people to evaluate their care, oftentimes patients report that they're very happy with their doctors. They're very satisfied with them because that they tend to look very positively on what doctors do. So this is a bias shaped by the fact that we like you, so we're going to tend to look at things that you do in a positive frame. Conversely, the pitchfork effect is just the opposite. It's where we don't have a very good impression of a person, and no matter what they do, we tend to look at it in somewhat of a negative light. And so you can look at, Donald Trump as a great example of this. For some people, he can do no wrong. Everything he does is something that's right and good. And for other people, he does nothing right. Everything that he does is wrong or bad, and the like. Now, the just world bias is an interesting one because this is the tendency for people to want to believe that the world is fundamentally just, and it causes them to rationalize an otherwise inexplicable justice as deserved by the victims. In other words, the world is a good place, right? Good things happen to people. It's a positive place. So if we have someone we find out if someone has been a victim of a sexual assault, this is where we oftentimes hear it. They've been a victim of a sexual assault. What we sometimes have, those that have a just world hypothesis, they would say, how could this be? This is not a good thing. There must be something that happened, like maybe the victim did something they weren't supposed to do. Maybe they were flirting too much. Maybe the way they were dressing seemed to make it more a come on. This is where we blame the victim. Bad things happen to them. And then because of the just world assumption, it must be because they brought it on themselves. Just between you and me, this is pretty disgusting. But, that's kind of the way it is. And people try to justify that in other kinds of ways as well. When we have what appears to be an unjust act, but we think about it as, well, surely that couldn't have been a bad thing that happened unless that person was deserving of that, thus reinforcing our notion of a just world bias. And stereotyping is where we believe a particular group has certain characteristics, and then we assume individuals within that group have the same characteristics. So you might think that, well, all professors tend to be brainiacs, and thus you must be very smart and a brainiac as a professor, when actually a lot of professors are kind of pretty mediocre in their level of intelligence. They got degrees, they're highly educated, but in terms of being smart, they're no more smarter than the average person on the street for all practical purposes. Or when you think of a group as being someone that's this group of people tend to be very dogmatic in their religion. If you make that assumption about that group, that this is a group that's dogmatic in their principles, then when you see a member of that group, you then make an assumption that they must be dogmatic in their religious beliefs too. That's stereotyping. We make judgments based on individuals, given our assumptions of the attributes of people that belong in that particular group. So where does this work in communication research? Well, it can work in a lot of ways, and we can talk about some more examples in class. Communication style and first impressions. So does a speaker with a heavy Southern accent make you think he or she is stupid or ignorant? Well, if so, that's an example of a stereotyping bias. Interpretation of communication behavior in relationships. Does someone showing up late for a meeting mean they are undependable? But on the other hand, when you show up late, there are circumstances beyond your control? That's the fundamental attribution error, where you attribute others' behavior to their internal characteristics, and you often attribute your behavior to the nature of the circumstances or the situation. Credibility in media content and representation. Fox or CNN, which is the one that has the fake news? These are examples of halo and pitchfork effects.